Okay, cool. I think that we can start. So thank you everybody for joining. My name is Michael. I'm from Aspecto, and um, we are hosting this session. So maybe a bit of a background why we decided to have this session. So we have a lot of experience with OpenTelemetry, and we know that one of the most complicated thing is to get started with OpenTelemetry. Sometimes the very first steps with OpenTelemetry, installing it, seeing that it's running, sometimes that's a big effort. So we took all the experience that we gained, all the issues, pitfalls, troubleshooting, debugging that we had to do, and we kind of summed it up into this session. So if you try to install OpenTelemetry and add an issue, or maybe you're about to do that and you will encounter some issues, so this session is for you. And as you know, this is a live session, so if you have any questions, just feel free to write them in the chat. And today we have Amir with us. Amir works at Aspecto as a software developer. And in the past, I don't know, year and a half or so, I think Amir did OpenTelemetry solely. And he has a lot of experience with it. And OpenTelemetry even decided to nominate him as an OpenTelemetry maintainer, which is kind of a big deal. That means that Amir can approve changes in the core of OpenTelemetry in JavaScript. Well, he's very active in that area. So I think I'll stop bore you with those things, and I'll let Amir tell you all the interesting things. So Amir, take it from here.
Cool. Okay, just a second. Amazing. So I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Michael. My name is Amir. I'm a software engineer at Aspecto. I've been working on OpenTelemetry for 2 years. And during those 2 years, I've been involved in many sessions of troubleshooting OpenTelemetry installation. Usually, a customer of ours or us ourselves, we try to instrument a service, and most of the times things go smooth. We look at the result in Jaeger or in Aspecto or in the vendor, and we see the telemetry data that we expect to see there. But sometimes things don't go so well. Like any software product, there's a lot of issues that can happen for like configuration or installation problems. And then we have to research and understand what went wrong. So during those 2 years, I encountered a lot of those issues, and I maintained a list of those issues, which I always came back to whenever there was a problem. And then I decided to write a blog post about this, summarizing all the things that are very common in OpenTelemetry installation. And this is the blog post. You can get a link to it, I assume, in the chat soon. And this talk, I'm going to show you like real examples of things that can go wrong and how I approach them, how I diagnose them, and what important things to notice when you doing this kind of work. So the requirements, this is not an intro to OpenTelemetry. It's not, I'm going to mention OpenTelemetry components and terms, and I'm not going to explain them from the beginning. I assume you have basic knowledge of OpenTelemetry and distributed tracing. You don't have to be an expert, even if you did it you only touched it a bit, it's okay. But if you're looking for something to get you started with OpenTelemetry, there are other resources which you can look for example, the OpenTelemetry Bootcamp. And all the examples in this talk are going to be in Node.js. but the principles are relevant to all programming languages. There's very little that is specific to Node.js. When I show something, there is an equivalent for that in all the major programming languages that OpenTelemetry supports. Okay, so let's talk about the problem. So you probably have a service. This is the blue rectangle here. This service, it receives a request or executing some internal operations. And what your goal is you basically want observability into this service. You want to be able to answer questions such as, why are my requests slow? What's causing my request to be slow? If your user encounter errors, you want to ask where are these errors coming from? What is the root cause of the errors? What's causing the errors? How can I fix them? Maybe your service, it exposes some external API, some HTTP endpoints, and you want to be able to know who is invoking these endpoints with what parameters, when. You want to be able to tell who's consuming messages that you publish over some queues or some pub subs, or you want to know who is publishing the message that you're consuming. These are all important questions that can really help development and DevOps teams. And this is a part of what OpenTelemetry is meant to be able to answer. So what we do is we basically install this OpenTelemetry SDK. This is the white rectangle within our service. OpenTelemetry is installed in our service. So we install the OpenTelemetry SDK, then we invoke some operations on the service. We anticipate these operations to create traces. So we export the traces to our collector and backend of choice. For example, Jaeger is a very popular open source collector and UI that is used to query and show traces. But this can be Jaeger, this can be Aspecto, this can be any vendor that you use, or any backend system that you want to send the traces to. And then we have two options. Option one, this is the top one, this is the green one. So we invoke operations on the service, and these operations, then we go to Jaeger, we search, we query for these operations which we expect to see, and we see them in Jaeger. We are happy, we have visibility into our service, everything is good, we can continue with our life and do other tasks. So this is the happy path, this is what we want to be happening. But the other option, down below in red, we invoke some operations on the service, then we go to Jaeger, we search for those traces that we expect to see, but they are not there. And then we ask ourselves, why aren't they there? So we know that we expect to see them. We know that something in the middle, probably in our installation of OpenTelemetry, is not functioning properly, and we have to start to dig in to the installation and understand what went wrong. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. Basically, how to do it. How do we understand where the problem is, how we diagnose it, how we solve it. This is the topic for today. So for this, I wrote like a very, very simple toy application. It's like, it does nothing sophisticated. It's like the most thin service that I could think about. So this is the service. It's in Node.js, in JavaScript. It exposes two HTTP endpoints, REST endpoints. One endpoint is get users, to get a list of the users, and another endpoint is post to users. This is an endpoint which we can use to add a new user to the system. So this service, what it does is it exposes those two endpoints, and it uses a database, a MongoDB database. So here we have, we import Express. Express is an HTTP framework for Node.js, and Mongoose, which is ORM for MongoDB. So we're able here to define a schema, then create a model for the schema. We connect to MongoDB database, and then when we query for users. We just execute find on the database, return the result, and when we want to add a new user, we just create it and save it to the database. Very simple, and I have here a Docker Compose file. This just sets up a MongoDB server on my local machine, which I can use for this demonstration. So let me start this Docker Compose. And now I want to start my application. So let's yarn start. And the application is starting. And now I can go to Postman and I can post, create a new user. I get back 200, it succeeded. I can get the list of all my users. This is the user that I just added, Bob, age 30. Everything is working well. We are happy, we have a service, but this service is not yet instrumented, right? So what we want to do, the next thing that we want to do is we want to add tracing, install OpenTelemetry in this service. So just as an overview, OpenTelemetry SDK, the installation, the thing that is running within your service, it's generally, it's a pipeline. It looks like this. We first have a tracer. The tracer is where spans are being generated. And after a span is created, it's being forwarded to a processor. The processor is responsible to drop non-sampled spans and to batch spans together into a batch, which is then forwarded to an exporter, which then sends this batch of spans over the network to some collector of your choice. This is how OpenTelemetry looks. So let's quickly add OpenTelemetry to our demo service. So we want to come here, stop the service. Let's check out the code. Okay, so basically what we've done is we installed here a bunch of OpenTelemetry packages like the API and the SDK and the exporter. Then I added a tracing TS file. This is a very basic installation of OpenTelemetry. It does nothing special. It's creating the tracer provider. Then I create an exporter, which export spans with OTLP protocol, OpenTelemetry protocol. It exports them to the local host, to a collector that is running on my local machine. Then we create a span processor. This span processor is only responsible to invoke the exporter. And I register my provider. And then what I'm doing is I'm creating a test span. This is just a span for testing. I just want to make sure everything works. So I get the tracer, I start a span and I end it immediately, and I want to see if that works. So because until now we had the MongoDB in the Docker Compose, but now we have two more components for OpenTelemetry. So we have the OpenTelemetry collector, which will receive the spans that our service is generating. And we have Jaeger. Jaeger is an open source tool that we can use to query and visualize the traces that we are going to generate. So let's Docker Compose up, start these services. And now I don't even start the service. I want to show you that I can now, because I started Jaeger, I can go here to the Jaeger UI and I can refresh it. And you see here that I can see Jaeger is up and running, but I don't see my service yet. If I go to my service and start it, I should be able to see this trace that I just created. Let's hope it works here. So I'll refresh my Jaeger, and here we can see this is the name of the service that we're testing against, the hotel troubleshooting, find traces, and I can see here the manual span that I just created. Great, amazing, everything is working as expected. We are now here. We installed OpenTelemetry and it works, and we're happy because it works. Okay, but that's not very interesting because we can generate manual span, but we don't want to see manual spans. We want to be able to get traces of the things that are really happening in the service. So if I trigger an HTTP endpoint, I want to see a trace saying that this HTTP endpoint was hit, that I access the MongoDB database. So for that, I'm going to be installing auto-instrumentation libraries. Auto-instrumentation libraries will do just that. So I'm going to stop my service and check out to this code. So these auto-instrumentation libraries, I installed here 3 libraries, one for HTTP, which we're using, one for Express, which is the HTTP framework, one for Mongoose, and in my tracing TS file, I register those 3 auto-instrumentation libraries like this. Now I can yarn start my service as before, and if I go to Jaeger, so currently I don't see these traces because I haven't invoked any HTTP endpoint yet. So I can go into my Postman and I can call this get on users and then refresh my Jaeger. And here I can see this trace, my HTTP get on here are all the span attributes. So I'm invoking the user's target and we can see everything that happened in the trace. This is the span for Express. This is the span for Mongoose. So we access the MongoDB database to invoke a find operation on the user's collection. Very simple, very straightforward. Everything is working and we are happy. Okay, so this is how it looks like. So we talked about the situation where everything is working, and I hope you will all have this experience and you don't have to use this talk to troubleshoot your application. But what happens if things don't go as expected? So this is the drawing that I showed you before, but here I show you common places or things that can go wrong with installation. So this is where problems usually occur. So of course, it's a software product. Like we all been there, we know that there are a million things that can go wrong. Like I can't cover all of them, but there are there are some things that are very, very common. Like a lot of users experience them, and I gave them number here. So the first one is that the tracer, this is the place where spans are being born, they're being generated. So the first class of errors is of problems is where the tracer is not even being invoked. So we have here an operation. This operation in a good installation, in ideal installation, it should have created spans, but the tracer is for some reason not being invoked. No spans are being generated, so the pipeline doesn't even begin, and that could be a very common reasons why we don't see any spans in our backend in Jaeger or Vendor or whatever. Another place where spans can get dropped is between the tracer and the processor. So the tracer is creating a span, and then instead of forwarding it to the processor, it's just getting dropped here. Another place is when the processor is forwarding spans to the exporter, it can drop them and not forward them to the exporter. And the fourth place, which is common for spans to get lost, is when the exporter is trying to send the spans to the collector, but for some reasons they are not, for some reasons they get lost on the way. Okay, so now let's see an example of that. So I want to check out to code with an error. So I'll stop my application. I'll git checkout here. Now I'll start the Docker Compose again. When I do it, the Jaeger, because currently I don't persist the data, it's being persisted in memory, which means that every time that I restart Jaeger, all my data is erased. So if I go here to Jaeger and I refresh it, you can see that the traces that we've seen before, they're erased. So it's very convenient. I can show you something and then start fresh. Okay, so now this is a very similar setup to what we've seen before, but there is an issue with this setup, so I can yarn start my application and then go back to Postman. Let's see if it's okay, it's up. Now I go to Postman and I can send a request. I see that I got a response. Now I want to go to my Jaeger, refresh it, and as you can see, I don't see this service, this hotel troubleshooting service that I've seen before. It's not here. Something is not working correctly, and I don't know what it is. I look at my code. Nothing pops up as a possible issue. And now I need to start investigating what happened. So my first tip to you, and this is the biggest tip that I want to give you, is no matter what you are debugging, you have to enable the OpenTelemetry logger. So this is how we do it in Node.js. There's equivalents to that in other programming languages. So I import the diagnostic API from OpenTelemetry API, and then I set a logger. The logger, I want all the log records to be printed to the console, and I need to tell it to give it a log level. So I'm giving it a debug. I effectively telling it that I want everything to be printed to the console. And let's now save this file, of course, if we want things to work, and restart the application. And now if we look at the console here, we should be able to see many log prints to the console. We can see here that the Express instrumentation is being patched, HTTP instrumentation, some log records. And now let's retry the request. So we sent the request, and we can look here at the diagnostic logger, and immediately we get an error saying that connection refused to localhost port 55681. So as you can see, instead of being lost and I didn't understand what happened, why was my trace not visible in Jaeger, now I have this very good tip from the console that saying that the connection was refused, and I can immediately spot this port, which I know is wrong, because if I go to my Docker Compose, I see that I'm expecting the spans to be on port 4318, and my OpenTelemetry installation is trying to send spans to another port. But why did it happen? So here I created the OTLP trace exporter, and I didn't give it any parameters. So usually there is a parameter called a URL, and we can give it a URL where it sends the spans to, but this URL is optional. So if I go to the documentation and I read here, I can see that the URL is optional. It can be omitted. The default is HTTP localhost 4318. That's why this is the URL that I'm using. So I said that this is the default. I don't have to write it. I can just omit it. But then when I ran the application, it tried to send to the wrong port. So why did it happen? If I look at my package.json, I installed here an old version of the exporter. This is version 26, and the documentation that I was reading, they refer to version 101. So I read the documentation of a newer version of the version that I'm using. So just by enabling the log, I was able to tell that this is the issue, and this is now very easy to solve it. I can just come here and set the URL to HTTP localhost, give it the right port, /v1/traces. Now I can start it again. Let's see, okay, it's up. I can send a request. Then let's see in Jaeger. And now I can see the service, find the traces. Here is the trace that I didn't see before. So what I want to, the message that I want to send is that it's very, very helpful to enable the OpenTelemetry diagnostic logger. And here, as you can see, I did it in I hard-coded the log level to be debug. But if you want, you can do something like this. So you can read the log level from the environment. There is this auto log level environment variable, which is standard. It's an OpenTelemetry specification. And then what you can do is, instead of yarn start, I'm going to do auto log level debug and start my application. And this is equivalent, but now I can control the log level from environment variable, which is very convenient. Okay, so we discuss our first problem. The problem was in the exporter, so the instrumentation library worked well, the processor worked well, the collector, everything was working well. The exporter had wrong configuration, and by enabling logging, we were very easily been able to detect that. And now, now I want to show you another example. So let me check out to the second example. Okay, and I'll start my Jaeger with all my components, and now I'm going to start application. Okay. So now I'm going to start my application, and I'm going to send a request, and then refresh Jaeger. And again, I don't see my service in this list. So my request, which I was anticipating to create a trace, I don't see this trace. I have to start to investigate what the issue is. So again, as I told you before, what we want to do is we want to enable logging and now run the application again with log level debug. So hotel log level equals debug, yarn start. I started my application and I want to see what the log can tell me. So immediately what I see here is that before we had like a very long list of log lines, and we could tell that all the auto instrumentation libraries that we registered, we can see that they were indeed enabled and patching, and now we don't see it. We don't see the Express instrumentation, we don't see the Mongoose instrumentation, the HTTP instrumentation. They are all missing from this list. So I have a good reason to suspect that this is the issue, that my instrumentation libraries, the beginning of this pipeline, they are not being properly installed, and they don't operate within the service. So this could be the reason why I don't see any traces in my service. So now I have a good suspicion what it can be, but I need to investigate. So I go to my blog post, a checklist for troubleshooting OpenTelemetry tracing issues. And here there is a section about auto instrumentation libraries. And I have here a few things that are very common. For example, install and enable. So did we install and enable the instrumentation libraries? Let's see. So in the package.json, here we can see that they're installed. Let's go to the tracing file. So we import these instrumentation libraries and we register them. So this is not the case. So we install and enable, we can check it as okay. And the next item here is enable before require. All instrumentations are designed such that they first need to be enabled, and only then we can require the instrumented package. So what does it mean? Let's go to the code. So here, this is the place where we register the instrumentations with OpenTelemetry SDK. This code, it sits in the tracing TS file. And if I go to index TS, this is the main entry point to my application. And I can see that I require the code that initializes OpenTelemetry on line 3. But before I do that, I import Express and Mongoose, which is exactly the problem, because I first import the packages and only then initialize OpenTelemetry. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that OpenTelemetry is the first thing that is being that happens in your service. You don't do anything before that. Let OpenTelemetry start, and then you can do all your business logic, and you can do all the code that import stuff and all the other code. So let's move this line to be first, and I'm going to save this file, and then the service will restart. So here the service restarted, and here I can see all the log records, which I couldn't see before. The Express instrumentation is patching Express. The HTTP is applying the patches. And Mongoose instrumentation is patching everything that it needs. Now, if I go to Jaeger, I will still not see the trace because I haven't invoked any endpoint yet. But let's invoke the endpoint and go back to Jaeger, refresh it, and the problem is solved. We can see here the trace which we didn't see before. So this was a second example of how enabling the OpenTelemetry logger can really help us. We just tell it to print diagnostic data into the screen, and I don't know, like 80% of the times you will immediately see what's wrong. Okay, so this was the second example, and now what I want to do is I want to discuss auto-instrumentation library issues, common issues with OpenTelemetry auto-instrumentation libraries. So this is number 1. This is the first case in this diagram. So the issue here is that no spans are even being generated. So of course, if nothing is being generated, we can't expect to later see it in Jaeger. So I have 4 common pitfalls in this category. So import before enable, this is what we just discussed. So we have to first initialize OpenTelemetry and only then execute our business logic, import packages and so on. The second bullet is, even though it's very straightforward, like if you want an auto-instrumentation library to automatically collect traces, then you have to first install it and register it in your application. But some users that are starting with OpenTelemetry, it's not always clear to them that they have to do this part of the code, that they really have to understand which packages they are using, install those packages, register those packages. Some people just install OpenTelemetry and they think that they get the full package, but this is not always the case. You have to do this code. So this is the second issue. The third issue is a non-supported version. Let's see an example of that. So I'm going to be stopping my application, and I'm going to check out to a different code example. Of course. Okay. So let's say that you have your service is working, it's been in production, it's reporting telemetry data, reporting tracing, you see those tracing, everything works well, and now you need to add a new package to your service. For example, your product tells you that you need to add a new feature and you have to introduce Redis into your service for this new feature. So what I have here is I install Redis. This is a Redis client in Node.js. And then in my one of my endpoints, I want that every time that I create a new user, I want to increment a counter in Redis. So I execute this code. And now I can, and of course, that I also install the auto instrumentation library for Redis. This is it. OpenTelemetry instrumentation Redis, and I registered it here. So what I'm expecting is I'm expecting that now that I will invoke this endpoint because I execute some operation against Redis, I'm expecting to see it in the trace that is going to be generated. So let's see if it works. I also added it here in Docker Compose, so now I have a Redis as well. So let's start Docker Compose, and now let's start our application. So the application started. Now I want to invoke this endpoint. Okay, I get back the response. Let's see what happens in Jaeger. So I refresh Jaeger, I have my service. I want to see the trace, but what happened? We see this HTTP span, this Express span, the Mongoose span, but where is the Redis span? We don't see it. Where did it go? Why is it not here? So let's go back to the code. And as I said before, we always want to run with the logging enabled. I forgot to do it here. I'll quickly copy it from my blog post. So I'm going to add logging and run my application again. And let's look at the logs, what they're going to be telling us. So I can see here the HTTP instrumentation, the Express instrumentation, the Mongoose instrumentation, but nothing about Redis. So it looks like Redis is not being enabled in the OpenTelemetry installation. But why? So to answer this question, we can go back to the blog, go to Auto Instrumentation Library. We know that we installed and enabled it correctly. We know that we first enabled it in OpenTelemetry and only then required it. What else can it be? So we have library configuration and instrumented library version. Okay, let's look at the version. So here the version of Redis that I installed in my application is 4.04. And let's look at the instrumentation library. So here is the instrumentation library. And I look at the supported versions, and it only supports version 2 and version 3. Version 4 is not yet supported. Okay, so now we get the result, we get the answer that we were looking for. This is the reason we don't see it here, because remember that auto instrumentation libraries, they don't promise support for all versions. If you're using something very new or a very old version, it might not be supported yet. So what can we do? So we have 3 options that I can think of. One option is we're saying, okay, it's not instrumented. I will just live without instrumentation for Redis. I will not see operations that I invoked against Redis in my service. A second option is to go to this instrumentation library and create a pull request, add support, which is currently missing for this new version. So this is option number 2. And the option number 3 is because we know that version 4 is very new, it's not yet supported. Let's try to downgrade to version 4. So yarn upgrade Redis to version 3, which is supported. And now we have to make slightly changes to the code because we changed the major version. So we no longer call connect, and we can't use the promise API. So we'll have to do this. Okay, and let's run the application again. I hope I didn't do any mistake here. But now we can invoke the endpoint again and go to our Jaeger, update, refresh it. And now we look at this trace again, and we see that it solved the problem. We have here this span for Redis increment with all the data about the operation. So that's another thing that is, yeah.
Tom had a question. He asked about the library auto instrumentation node, the one that allows you to register all the official instrumentation automatically. Would you recommend to use it?
Yeah, so there's a package that what I'm showing you here is like the very low level, like how you will set up OpenTelemetry yourself. So there are other packages out there that makes your life a bit easier. One of them is the auto instrumentation node, which basically already have this list of well-known instrumentations from the contrib repository, and you can just install it, and it will automatically install all the instrumentations that you that are supported by OpenTelemetry. Yeah, it's you can use it. I recommend to use it. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. So what we've seen here is that it's very important if things don't work. Maybe you're using a package that is not yet supported. And the other thing that I want to show, this I think will be the last one because we're running out of time, is that every auto instrumentation library has configuration. And this configuration can sometimes cause problems. And I want to show you an example. So let's go back to the code. Let's check out. So let's check out here and run our Docker Compose again. And here I want to describe what I'm doing. So before the previous example, I showed you how to use the Redis package, but there is another Redis client. It's called IORedis. So let's assume that instead of Redis, we're using IORedis, and we're doing everything as before. We're incrementing a key here every time that we create a new user. And here what I added is I want every 10 seconds, I want to read the number of users from the Redis and print into the console. Of course, in your service, it will probably be something more complicated, but just to show you an example. And now I want to start my application. And I want to invoke this endpoint. So every 10 seconds, it should print to the console the number of users that I have. So user count equals 1. And here you can see that I'm invoking a get operation on my Redis. So I want to go to Jaeger and make sure that I see this trace. Make sure, because I'm accessing the database, it should generate a trace. I go here, I refresh. Let's look at the traces. So I see that I invoked the HTTP post, but I don't see here the span about this operation of Redis get. So what is the issue here? If we go to the documentation of the instrumentation library, we can see that we can create an instance of this instrumentation library and give it configuration. So one of the configuration option is called require parent span, and the default is true. What this option does, it means that it requires, in order to create a new span for Redis, it requires that it has a parent, which means that if the trace starts with the Redis span, then we are not generating this is the trace for this operation, which is a bit, it can be a bit confusing to people because the default is to not generate trace. And if you want to be traces to be generated, you have to specifically go to the code here, go to where you start your iOredis instrumentation and tell it require parent span, and the default is true, but we want to set it to false. Okay, and now I'm going to save it, and the application will restart. And now, after the application is restarted, every 10 seconds it should invoke this get operation on Redis. Now let's see what's happening in Jaeger. So I refresh it, and here is the span that I didn't see before. So the tip is that every auto instrumentation library comes with a configuration. This configuration can sometimes, the default configuration can sometimes be not to generate spans. This is also very common in HTTP. In HTTP, you have things like ignore incoming request hook or require parent for outgoing spans. These are all configurations options that allow you to hide or disable or not generate traces in some scenarios. And if you don't see traces, it might be a good idea to read the documentation for the libraries that you're using and check if there is some configuration option that you need to turn on or off for that to work. Okay, so there are many other issues that can cause your installation to fail. They're all written here in the blog post, so I don't have time to go over all of them, but you're very welcome to read. It's all the examples are in Node, but most of the things are relevant to OpenTelemetry in general. So you can read it in the blog if you have questions or you want to discuss something, or if something isn't clear, you're very welcome to reach out in Slack to the OpenTelemetry Bootcamp channel. We're there to help you solve your issues and answer questions. And that's it for the live demo. And now I want to ask you if you have any questions for me. So I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, feel free to ask questions if you have in the chat, or unmute yourself and ask a question. In the meanwhile, maybe just a quick word about our bootcamp. So our bootcamp is almost 6 hours long of a free vendor-neutral content about OpenTelemetry, from the very basics of how to get started with OpenTelemetry to more advanced stuff like managing OpenTelemetry in production, and all the different concerns you should take into place. So yeah, if you're interested in that and getting started with OpenTelemetry, I think it's a good resource to start. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us, and we are here if you have any questions.